Hi, my name's Mike Parker from Mining Footprint. We continue our series of discussions on how to look at mining through the lens of international relations theory. I'm joined by our international relations practitioner, Jake Erickson. Hi, Jake, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Enjoying a sunny day in beautiful Illinois.
So far, we've talked about realism in week 1 and liberalism in week 2. Now we're moving on to materialism. So, Jake, just explain to us what's behind the international relations theory of materialism.
In previous discussions, we talked about international relations traditionally being something that focuses on countries. Over time, though, actors began to recognize that there's more elements to a country than just whether or not you have a large military or whether or not you have national interests that you're trying to pursue. There's also an element of economics, right, which seems to be the central component of daily life in most countries, is how you interact with this massive region of the world, this human construct that we call the economy, something that you participate in every day. So theories in international relations evolved to account for the behaviors of actors within international markets. And traditional international relations theory viewed markets the way traditional economists would view the market, which is actually very similar to the state. Rational actors pursue their self-interest under the assumption that they know what's best for them. So in this perfect world of supply and demand, which determines the price of a market good, ultimately the market operates in an ideal fashion where consumers set the price of a good. Now, theories began to evolve which challenged this assumption that rational actors behave according to perfect information or even behave rationally at all. And this is where you begin to see the rise of materialism, which actually has its origins in ancient Greece, and argued that a key component to the meaning of life and how we derive meaning comes through the amount of material goods that we have. So materialism attempts to explain why we assign value to things and how that shapes the relationship between groups in society, chiefly the rich and the poor. In other words, it's an attempt to explain inequality.
And as materialism has been studied through human history, it's actually been taken up by various political thought. And could you just give us some background on some of the political theories that are related to materialism?
During the era of traditional economic theory being developed alongside international relations theory, you had some key events occurring in human history, chiefly among them the takeover of Russia and the Tsarist overthrow. During this time, you had revolutionary actors who were espousing sort of a different element of materialism than what had been seen previously. Their focus was not just on inequality, but on the social classes that seemed to reinforce the social inequality, which they called the bourgeois and the proletariat. These two groups were necessary in order to create what the Marxists referred to as the capitalist system, and argued that the acquisition of capital through private property is key to reinforcing this inequality between rich and poor, worker and landowner, for instance.
So in this sense, then, Marxism talks about capitalism and talks about capitalist exploitation.
If we were to contrast it real quick with traditional economic theory, which argues that the price of the good is at its ideal point and that's determined by supply and demand, Marxists would critique that and say that there are certain prices that are left out of the creation of that material wealth and that ultimate price point. And they argue that that lost revenue comes in the form of worker exploitation, the idea that workers are not being paid adequate wages so that the price of the commodity can go down. Clearly, this is something that neoliberal economists, for instance, would disagree with. They would argue that whatever the price of the good is in the market, that is the ideal price of it, and that any costs associated with the creation of that good are ultimately reflected in how the market behaves. With perfect information, actors already know all the price points that come into the purchase of the good and still ultimately determine that they'll purchase it at X, Y, and Z rate. Marxists point out that actors might not have that information. Actors might not be aware that workers are being underpaid or underutilized or exploited in some way. And because of that, those utilizing worker resources can set the price at a higher rate and acquire those resources for something other than workers' compensation.
Now, how do you see this materialism being introduced into some of the mining issues that we've been looking at?
Private property that one owns is a key component to how value is created.
Property in the mining world revolves around what is considered as a surface area, a closed off area exclusively given to an exploration company or a mining company to carry out geological or exploration work, or actually then carry out mining on this area, which is a physical, tangible property which they control and which has been arranged through a technical and financial agreement with the host government. The state is usually the key actor, because the state is the entity that divides its surface area into portions of land it considers suitable to give to individual companies. It then gives out those portions of land, usually in a capacity which is limited over time, say for 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, or wherever it may be. And commonly those companies have to pay some form of rent. It can be $500,000 or millions of dollars per annum just to maintain the rent on those properties.
A hegemon is a social construct that everybody recognizes. Hegemony is definitely something that the concept of it, right, originated in Marxist thought, but it's used in a wide variety of theories outside of Marxism. Marxism just happened to be the first theory that identified a specific hegemon, and at the time it didn't really know that hegemony could be applied to other entities besides social classes. It didn't even conceptualize of a state as a hegemon the way that we do now. So a key part to how hegemony is created is legitimacy. If you were to talk about a local community, some local sector or group of people in a given space that the mining company in this case is trying to work with, perhaps because they live on the lands or the surface area that the mine company is looking to explore and question. So when you're looking at it from a mine company perspective or a national government, and you're trying to identify the community that's been impacted by the mine project, you're interacting with the community, which we call in international relations, the hegemon. In the same token, if you're a local community interacting with your national government, at some level, there's an implicit recognition there that the national government is the actor who you have to engage with in order to engage with the mine company through these acquisition of mineral rights and prior consent. If you're looking at it from the national government perspective, the mine company is the hegemon you're interacting with. The essence of it is that social constructs are everywhere, and when we give it a name, something that we can interact with, this tangible actor, it becomes a hegemon. Remember that a key component to Marxism is the breakdown of society into two hegemons, the upper, lower class, the proletariat, the bourgeois. The materialists don't necessarily agree with that argument. They're only concerned with how material wealth is created. Our argument here does not necessarily agree with the view of breaking down society into two classes, but rather draws from the Marxist perspective that hegemons exist.
So hegemony is a sort of a subtle form of political power which relies more strongly on consent than coercion. And in this power, these dominant groups form a vision that appears to serve the interests of all that are going to be dominated. And in this sense, where big mineral deposits and big projects need to be developed, and international mining companies that have the financial capacity and the technical know-how are really the only ones that can come and do that. they actually come into countries with hegemonic behavior because they are demonstrating that they themselves can add value to that particular mineral deposit and do it in such a fashion that basically they will add to the wealth and to the development of the country as they go ahead and do the project. And because of that, what they do has a very positive impact on the economy of the region or the country. Their activities tend to be supported by neoliberal or liberal international organizations that would like to see various countries become developed through the use of their natural resources. And that's a sort of a hegemonic behavior. Is that more or less how it's viewed?
Yes, the key element that you identified to hegemony is consent, right? There's some element of legitimacy associated with the creation of a hegemon or a social construct, right? And it comes in the form of widespread recognition. If you look at communities protesting a local mine site, it typically revolves around the use of the land in some way, shape, or form. And the reason why is because as a hegemon, a local community is tied to the space that it exists in, the land that it lives on. That seems to be a really key component to what it means to be a community. When you impact the land, then you impact not only the material interests that the community might have, but also the identity that comes with it. And that identity is only made possible by the years that took place in order for that community to develop around that piece of land.
So in the mining industry, mineral rights, which is the concept of property, which is vested in the state, gives the owner the right to benefit from the minerals. But then if the surface is owned by a different surface rights holder, the ability to benefit comes from access agreements with the surface rights holders. Many relationships between mining companies and communities end up starting up as very transactional, where rents are paid to drill some exploration drill holes. People are employed in the company as some form of quid pro quo for access to certain areas. And those sorts of relationships are quite short-termist and end up being very expensive and create a huge amount of expectations and dependency. And when those relationships come to an end, because they are unsustainable, that's where a lot of community-company conflicts originate in these areas that the surface rights holder agreement is needed to obtain access.
The access agreement is the key element here. If it's written in a way that supports not only a positive relationship with the community, but ultimately one that elevates the community, that enables its existence, that doesn't undermine it.
Absolutely, and in fact, the best relationships that exist in the mining industry today between mining companies and communities or surface rights holders are in fact transformational relationships, where the long-term nature of the relationship has been taken into account, and the fact that the mining company needs to make changes to both the physical part, the physical nature of the area, and the socio-economic situation of the area. Both those are taken into account, and this transformation is done in parallel, hand in hand, so that as the mining company benefits from access to the mineral resources, the community itself also benefits in a transformational fashion, whether that be by relocation into better conditions than they originally were living in, or whether that be by work opportunities, or whether that be by the government of the area having now the ability to come in and use that area as a focal point to develop education and health services in remote areas. That transformational relationship is the key to making sure that mining projects can survive and flourish in areas where they have to interact closely with surface rights holders.
So in a sense, you're either trying to keep the community the way it is or improve it, but never let it weaken or deconstruct as a hegemon. And here we see the original point of the materialist and ultimately to some extent the Marxist narrative as well, right? Which is that we're not breaking this down according to social class, we're breaking it down on the existence of facts on the ground. there's a community here that is impacted in some way, shape, or form by the mine site. And unless we account for the human construct element of this, the immaterial impacts faced by the community, then the material benefits that come with the project will never be enough.
And I think that's what demonstrates the pluralism of mining and why it's so important to take this very wide viewpoint. We've talked about some very strong political theory, the concept of property, the concept of exploitation, the concept of value, and the concept of transactions. And when you put all those into one melting pot, and the common denominator is a mining project, it starts to get easier to understand why some mining projects are natural funnels for conflict, which involve many, many actors. They involve community actors that are dissatisfied with the conditions that are happening on the ground. They involve regional actors that are trying to protect the environment and the social structure of the region. They involve actors that have very great objections to the concept of property and the concept of exploitation, that have very different ideologies from the way that a country is being run and the way it's basically managing its mineral properties. They involve international actors and people that view mining as inherently a bad activity and use the various political and other social theories that abound around mining to form a very strong critique against mining. So it's maybe in that sense that when a mining project starts in an area and a conflict starts to happen, but suddenly it mushrooms into this very serious regional national conflict where many, many actors are involved, and many mining companies just become totally overwhelmed and just can't understand why suddenly, if all they wanted to do was go into an area, speak to the local community, and to construct a mine, they're now having to deal with attacks by senior politicians, by ideological groups, and even by international ideological groups against the very activity that they're trying to carry out. We've just given a taste of the very, very broad impact that mining has.
Mm-hmm.
It's across all political, ideological, social aspects. And there are many, many people that have a lot to say about mining because of that very broad ideological spread of the impacts of mining and the concept of mining property.
And it also justifies the original mission of Mining Footprint, which is our focus is on using multiple perspectives to understand a given scenario and provide the most objective feedback possible. And it is not possible to give objective feedback unless you account for all the factors that come into being. And regardless of whether or not those factors are something that you can hold in your hand, they ultimately may still explain why a project stopped in the first place.
Thanks very much for that super interesting discussion. And next time we'll come back, we'll be talking about constructivism, which I'm looking forward to. And thanks for your time and stay safe in the USA.
Thanks, Mike. I look forward to next week when we can talk about the mining industry and its application to the constructed world.